Here's what you've been told. Billionaires just love the grind. They wake up at 4 in the morning, they crave the 80-hour weeks, they get some kind of twisted pleasure out of doing the things you dread. And somewhere along the way, you decided that must mean something is wrong with you. That if you don't leap out of bed excited to work on your business, your book, your body, your future, then you're simply not built like they're built. You're missing the gene, the hunger, the fire. Here's the problem with that story. It's not just wrong, it's backwards. And I want to say something that's going to sound strange at first, so stay with me. This is barely a metaphor. When we say some people are rewired to tolerate hard things, we're pointing at something with a real physical basis in how the brain processes effort and anticipation. It isn't a personality trait, and it isn't a moral advantage that some people were simply born with. It's a pattern built through repetition, and patterns can, at least partly, be rebuilt. The people who seem to push through difficulty without flinching are not necessarily experiencing that difficulty the same way you are. Over years, often without realizing it, they've changed the relationship between effort and reward inside their own heads so that the hard thing itself stops registering purely as a threat and starts registering, at least some of the time, as a signal that something worthwhile is happening. That shift isn't magic, and it isn't some innate advantage. It's neurochemistry, repetition, and design. And design can be studied, borrowed, and rebuilt somewhere else, including inside you. So before we go any further, I want to say this clearly because I think you need to hear it. This will not judge you. Not for the procrastination, not for the abandoned gym membership, the unopened business plan, the fact that you've started this exact kind of video before, looking for the one insight that finally sticks. None of that means you're weak. It means your brain has been running on an old set of instructions that made a lot of sense for most of human history and make almost no sense now. In the next few minutes, we're going to take apart the myth of the naturally disciplined person piece by piece. We're going to look at the actual mechanism inside your brain that makes hard things feel unbearable. We're going to look at real documented examples of how some of the most driven people alive, billionaires, and the billionaire-minded builders who came up alongside them actually built their relationship with difficulty, not the mythologized version, the real one. We're going to hand you a concrete, repeatable method for closing the gap between you and them. And at the end, we're going to arrive somewhere deeper than technique, somewhere that actually changes who you think you are. That's the real promise behind learning to rewire your brain, to love hard things like billionaires do. It's not a mindset trick, it's a mechanism, and mechanisms can be learned. Let's start with the lie you've been told the longest. The lie is this: disciplined people simply have more willpower. They grit their teeth harder. They want it more. This idea is comforting in a strange way because it lets you off the hook. It's just not in your nature, but it's also devastating because it tells you the door is closed. You weren't built for this, except mostly you were. And the reason the willpower story survives is that it's simple, and simple stories spread. The truth is a little more uncomfortable and a lot more useful. Here's the deeper truth. Your brain did not evolve to love effort. It evolved to conserve energy. For most of human history, unnecessary exertion could get you killed. Chasing prey you didn't need to chase, exploring territory that offered no clear payoff, spending calories on anything that wasn't directly tied to survival. The brain that burned the least energy for the most certain reward was the brain that tended to survive and pass on its genes. That's roughly the same brain sitting inside your skull right now, in 2026, trying to decide whether to open your laptop and work on the thing that scares you, or scroll for 11 more minutes. This is where dopamine comes in, and this is the part almost nobody explains correctly. Dopamine is not simply the pleasure chemical people casually call it. The neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky, who has spent much of his career studying reward circuitry, has described dopamine less as the chemistry of pleasure and more as the chemistry of anticipation, the wanting, not the having. And decades earlier, the neuroscientist Wolfram Schultz produced some of the foundational research showing that dopamine neurons don't just fire when a reward arrives. They fire based on the gap between what the brain expected and what actually happened, a concept now widely known as reward prediction error. Here's why that detail changes everything. If your brain has learned through repetition that a hard task reliably leads somewhere, a finished product, a real improvement, a version of you that's slightly more capable, it can start releasing dopamine the moment you approach the task, not only when you finish it. The difficulty itself becomes part of the cue. But if your brain has learned that a hard task usually ends in frustration, interruption, or a reward that never quite materializes, it tends to produce something else instead, a stress response, avoidance, something close to the bodily sensation of encountering an actual threat. So when you sit down to do the hard thing and feel that wave of resistance, that itch to check your phone, that sudden urgent need to reorganize your desk, you are not lazy. You're having a threat response to a task your brain has, through experience, come to associate with a bad outcome. Elite performers are not immune to this system, and one story makes that almost uncomfortably visible. In 2018, during what's widely reported as the most brutal stretch of Tesla's Model 3 production, Elon Musk described in interviews given at the time working close to 120 hours in a single week. Biographers who covered that period describe him sleeping on a couch on the factory floor, sometimes going days without leaving the building, walking the line at 3 a.m., checking machinery himself. By his own account, this wasn't a man who'd found some secret joy in exhaustion. He's described that period since as brutal, isolating, and at times something closer to a breakdown than a triumph. Nobody in that factory at 3 a.m. was flooded with enthusiasm for the task in front of them. What kept the effort going, by every account of that period, wasn't a feeling at all. It was a decision he'd made long before about the kind of person he'd already committed to being, that made stopping simply not an option his brain seriously entertained, no matter how the moment felt. That's one end of it, grinding through exhaustion because an identity demanded it. But the mechanism doesn't only show up as suffering. It shows up in something far quieter, too. Warren Buffett has talked openly in interviews and shareholder letters about spending roughly 5 to 6 hours of most days simply reading, not glamorous, not exciting in any conventional sense, just a repeated, almost boring rep, done so consistently for so many decades that it stopped requiring a decision at all. Two completely different textures of effort. One loud and brutal, one quiet and almost invisible, but the same underlying pattern sits underneath both of them. Neither man was waking up flooded with excitement for that day's specific task. Both had brains that had, through years of repetition, quietly rewired the prediction. Effort here tends to pay off. Here's the one-line thesis I want you to remember, because we're going to return to it more than once. You don't love hard things by trying harder. You love hard things once your brain has real evidence that hard things pay off. But that leaves something unexplained, and it's the part almost nobody talks about. If this is really about a learned prediction, not a fixed trait, then why does the same task feel unbearable on some days and almost automatic on others? Why can a person who can't work on their business on a random Tuesday somehow do it without a second thought the week before a launch? What's actually deciding, moment to moment, whether your brain treats effort as a threat or a signal? The answer isn't inside your head at all. It's sitting on your desk right now. We've been taught to treat every failure of discipline as an internal failure, a lack of grit hiding somewhere in your psychology. But behavioral scientists who study habit formation, including B.J. Fogg at Stanford, have spent decades demonstrating something that should have ended the willpower myth a long time ago. Behavior is shaped overwhelmingly by environment, not by intention. Motivation is unreliable. It rises and falls with your sleep, your stress, your blood sugar. Environment doesn't fluctuate like that. It just sits there, quietly making the hard thing easier or harder, whether you're paying attention to it or not. Let me give you the scene because I think you'll recognize it. It's 9 p.m. You've told yourself, again, that tonight's the night you finally open the business plan you've been circling for months. Your laptop is on the coffee table, lid closed, 3 feet away from you. Next to it, your phone is lying face up, screen glowing every few minutes with a new notification. The TV remote is closer to your hand than the laptop charger. There's a half-eaten bag of chips on the counter in your eye line, and somewhere in the back of your mind is the memory that the last 3 times you opened that document, you didn't know where to start, so you closed it again within 4 minutes. Nothing about that room is neutral. Every object in it is a small vote for or against the hard thing, and right now the votes are stacked against you before you've even made a decision. This is what we're going to call the friction ratio. The relative ease of doing the hard thing compared to the relative ease of doing the easy thing, measured in seconds and steps, not intentions. It's not about whether you want to work on the business plan. It's about whether wanting to has to fight through extra friction, getting up, opening the laptop, finding the file, remembering where you left off, while the easy alternative requires none at all because it's already glowing in your hand. The friction ratio explains something that used to look like a contradiction. It explains why the same person who has no discipline at home will show up for a run without complaint the second they join a structured group with a set meeting time and a friend waiting at the corner. Nothing changed inside them. What changed is that the friction to skip got dramatically higher. Now skipping means disappointing someone, texting an excuse, while the friction to show up got dramatically lower because the decision was already made for them the moment they said yes to the group. This isn't just intuition. Psychologist Peter Galwitzer's research on what he called implementation intentions found that people who formed extremely specific plans, not "I'll work out more," but "I will put on my shoes at 7 a.m. by the door before I check my phone," followed through at meaningfully higher rates than people relying on general motivation alone. The specificity did work that willpower was never going to do. It lowered the friction on the hard behavior by removing the moment of decision entirely. You weren't choosing to run. You'd already chosen days earlier, and your environment was simply carrying out the choice. This reframes the entire problem. You are not failing to love hard things because you're broken. You're failing because you're standing in a room, often built by accident, that makes the easy thing effortless and the hard thing require a small act of heroism every single time. And this is exactly the detail that gets left out of the mythologized billionaire story. Jeff Bezos has talked in interviews about protecting his mornings for what he calls high IQ decisions and avoiding important meetings later in the day once his mental sharpness has worn down. He hasn't laid out the exact reasoning line by line, but the reasonable read is straightforward. He engineered his calendar around the hours his brain works best, instead of relying on willpower to force good decisions at 6 p.m. on no sleep. That's not raw discipline. That's environment and sequencing designed on purpose. So, if the real lever isn't motivation, and it isn't willpower, and it's actually about redesigning the friction around you, how do you actually do that without turning your life into some rigid, joyless system? How do you apply this without it becoming just another thing you abandon in 9 days like everything else? This is where we need a second framework, one that builds directly on the friction ratio. And I want to give it a name because names make ideas usable. The micro-rep method. The core insight behind the micro-rep method is this. Your brain doesn't build a prediction that effort leads to reward from one big heroic effort. It builds that prediction from repetition of small, completed reps. A muscle doesn't get strong from one perfect workout, and your dopamine system doesn't get rewired from one motivated Monday. It gets rewired the same way any prediction gets rewired, through evidence repeated enough times that the pattern becomes the default. There are 4 sub-principles that make this actually work, rather than becoming one more idea you nod along to and forget by dinner. Principle 1. Shrink the unit until resistance disappears. Not write for an hour. Open the document and write 1 sentence. Not run 5 miles. Put on your shoes and walk to the end of the street. The task has to be small enough that your brain cannot generate a credible threat response to it. This isn't about laziness. It's about giving your nervous system a rep it can complete easily enough to log it as a win, because a logged win is what starts rewriting the prediction. Principle 2, remove the decision point. Don't rely on the moment. The decision to do the hard thing should happen once, in advance, the night before, the week before, not in the charged, resistant moment when you're standing in front of the task itself. That's what Golitz's research was really showing. The moment of doing shouldn't require a moment of choosing. Principle 3, stack the environment in favor of the rep. Put the object connected to the hard task somewhere more convenient than the object connected to the easy one. Laptop open on the desk, not closed on the shelf. Running shoes by the door, not in the closet. Phone in a different room, not face up on the coffee table. You're not disciplining yourself into compliance. You're rigging the room so compliance is the path of least resistance. Principle 4, let the reward land immediately. Even if it's small, don't wait for the big, distant outcome, the finished business, the 10-pound loss, to feel like it counts. Notice the completed rep itself. Cross it off. Say it out loud. Your brain needs proof fast that the effort produced something, or the prediction never updates. Now let's go back to that same room, 9 p.m., laptop on the coffee table, phone glowing beside it. Before, the laptop is closed and 3 feet away, the phone is closer and already lit up. There's no plan for what happens when you sit down, and the task in your head is enormous and undefined. Work on the business, which means your brain has no way to complete a rep, only to fail at an ambiguous, endless one. Every night ends the same way, because the room and the plan were both built to produce that ending. After, the laptop is already open on the desk before dinner, positioned exactly where you'll sit. The phone is charging in the bedroom, out of reach and out of sight. The decision was made that morning. Not work on the business, but write 2 sentences of the client email section. A rep so small, it barely qualifies as effort. You sit down, you do the 2 sentences in 90 seconds, and instead of stopping, you notice you're already moving, already 3 sentences past where you thought you'd stop. Because starting was the only hard part, and starting no longer requires heroism. You close the laptop, and for 1 second you actually feel something close to satisfaction. That's not motivation. That's a completed rep, logged, becoming evidence. That's the mechanism. Small reps, low friction, immediate acknowledgement, repeated enough times that your brain quietly updates its prediction. Effort here leads somewhere, and once that prediction updates enough times, something strange starts to happen. The resistance you used to feel starts to fade, not because you got more disciplined, but because your nervous system stopped treating the task as a threat in the first place. But there's a trap hiding inside everything we've just built, and if we don't name it, it'll quietly sabotage the whole method. It's a belief so common in self-improvement content that most people have never once questioned it, and it doesn't hold up. Take Sara Blakely, who's talked in interviews about the early years of building Spanx, working a day job selling fax machines while spending nights and weekends on a product almost every store rejected. She's been open that those years weren't fun in the moment. She's described real doubt, real exhaustion, long stretches with no external proof it would work. She hasn't framed it as chasing some daily feeling of loving the grind, and that's worth taking at face value rather than romanticizing further. What's a reasonable read of that period based on what she has said is that she was protecting a decision she'd already made about who she was going to be, and the nightly effort followed from that decision rather than from any enthusiasm for the task itself. The belief we've been sold is this: you need to learn to love the process. Fall in love with the grind, enjoy the journey, find joy in the daily work itself. It sounds inspiring, and it's almost entirely a myth. Here's the harsh, liberating truth underneath it. You don't need to love the process. You need to love what the process is, quietly turning you into. Almost nobody who has built something enormous actually enjoys the grinding middle of it in the moment. What they've done is attach the effort to an identity they care about far more than the discomfort of any single session. They're not in love with the fourth rewrite of the business plan. They're in love with being the kind of person who does the fourth rewrite instead of quitting after the first draft. The love was never for the process. It was for the person the process was building. Picture two versions of the same person trying to build the same business. The first is chasing motivation, waiting to feel excited before opening the laptop, treating the absence of enthusiasm as a valid reason to stop. That person lasts, on average, about as long as their mood holds up, which for most people trying something genuinely hard is not very long at all. The second person isn't waiting to feel anything. They sit down at the same time each evening because that's simply what they do now. The way you brush your teeth without needing to feel inspired about oral hygiene. They don't need to love tonight's session. They just need it to be consistent with who they've decided they are. 3 months later, the first person has a folder of abandoned drafts and a growing sense of shame. The second person has a business built almost entirely out of sessions they didn't particularly enjoy in the moment, but that added up into something they're proud of now. That's the myth inside the myth. Chasing the feeling of loving hard work will almost always fail because feelings are unreliable, but building an identity that simply does hard things with or without the feeling will work far more often because identity doesn't need to feel like anything on a given Tuesday to keep functioning. Here's the part that changes everything. Musk, Buffett, and Blakely didn't build what they built by loving the process, and none of them have claimed otherwise. They built it by becoming someone the process no longer had power over. That's a different thing entirely, and it's the last layer we haven't opened yet. Here's the deepest layer, the one everything else has been quietly building toward. You do not change your relationship to hard things by changing your behavior first. You change it by changing who you believe you already are and letting the behavior follow almost as an afterthought from that belief. This is the real identity shift. And it's the difference between someone who is trying to become disciplined and someone who simply is the kind of person for whom this is what they do. Think about everything we've covered. The dopamine mechanism only rewires because repeated small reps give your brain evidence about what kind of person you are. The friction ratio only works because a rigged environment makes the hard behavior the path of least resistance for a person who already sees themselves as someone who follows through. The room reflects an identity back at you, and over time you start living up to what it reflects. The micro-rep method only sticks because each tiny completed rep isn't just building a habit, it's quietly building a case file, one small piece of proof at a time that you are someone who does the thing. And the myth of loving the process falls apart the moment you realize the people who push through hard things were never chasing a feeling. They were living out an identity, and any warmth toward the process, if it ever showed up, was a side effect that arrived later, sometimes years later, sometimes never at all. This is why the Billionaires Love Hard Things story survives, even though most of them in their own words will tell you the hard things never stopped being hard. What changed wasn't the difficulty. What changed is that difficulty stopped being evidence against them and started being evidence for who they'd already decided to become. Every rep, every rigged room, every tiny completed sentence in a document you didn't feel like opening, none of that was really about productivity. It was about quietly, repeatedly, proving a new identity to the only person who was ever really watching you. So here's what I want you to remember. Trying harder was never the missing ingredient. What was missing was evidence that this specific hard thing actually leads somewhere. You don't need to fall in love with the process. You need to fall in love with who the process is turning you into. And maybe the truest version of all of it, discipline was never a feeling you were missing. It was an identity you hadn't given yourself permission to claim yet. This is really what it means to rewire your brain, to love hard things like billionaires do. Not forcing yourself to enjoy the grind, but building enough small proof that the grind is worth it that your brain stops treating it as a threat. It's the same underlying idea behind identity-based habits. the concept James Clear made popular in Atomic Habits. You don't become a writer by finishing a book. You finish the book because you already decided you were a writer. Discipline, willpower, motivation, all of it follows from that decision, not the other way around. You don't need a bigger dose of motivation. You need one small, low-friction rep done today. That gives your brain the first piece of evidence for a version of you who follows through. That's the whole mechanism underneath every framework we just walked through. So here's my question for you, and I actually want you to answer it in the comments. What is the one hard thing you've been avoiding? Not because you don't want it, but because the room you're in makes the easy thing effortless, and the hard thing require heroism. And what's one object you could physically move today to change that ratio?